Well, our first reading today from the book of the prophet Micah takes place in a courtroom, but not the kind of courtroom with a gavel and a witness stand in the middle of a courthouse. Rather, this courtroom is a vast outdoor mountainous landscape full of hills and tall peaks. And into this courtroom, God arrives. And God says, I have a case against my people. And I call upon all these mountains to serve as a witness to this case that I will make. In fact, I call upon all of the ground that makes up the foundation of the earth to be a witness to my case. And then God states God's case against God's people. God says, what is up with you all? I rescued you from slavery in Egypt. I've taken care of you. I've given you a covenant and the law to help you care for one another. And yet, you are cruel to each other. You worship other gods. What gives? The people shift uncomfortably in their shoes, hearing that. And one of them speaks up in response. This person feels convicted by what God says. After all, this person and all the people know that God is right. They have been cruel to each other. At the time this book was written, wealthy landowners were enriching themselves at the expense of peasant farmers. And we too, when we hear this passage, might shift uncomfortably in our shoes because we kind of know God is right. We too are cruel to each other sometimes. Together, we sometimes do, in our imperfections, contribute to the sufferings and inequality in our society. And the fact that God calls upon the mountains and the hills to serve as a witness to God's case against God's people maybe helps us feel, can make us feel a little bit uncomfortable as well, because it makes us think about the ways we've harmed the natural world. So God's case against us makes us feel uncomfortable, just like it makes the people who hear it in the story uncomfortable. And one of them, feeling overwhelmed by what God has said and wondering, how can I possibly make this right? One of them speaks up in response and says, God, if I sacrifice a calf to you, will that be enough? Occasional animal sacrifice was a normal part of ancient Israelite religion, a good way for folks to grow closer to God, kind of like how coming to church can be a good way for us to grow closer to God. But the person answering the question or asking the question knows that just offering a sacrifice of a calf isn't enough to answer God's case, isn't enough of a response to God, just as we know that just coming to church on a Sunday isn't quite enough to answer God's call. So, despairing, this person continues, well, if I sacrificed 1,000 rams to you, will that be enough, God? That's absurd. Nobody has 1,000 rams. It would be like if one of us said, if I go to church 62 times a day, will that be enough, oh God? This person is feeling despair, thinking that nothing can make this right. And then this person takes it to another level. God, if I offered you my firstborn, would that be enough? The fruit of my body for the sins of my soul? This person is hurting. And I can relate because, after all, we humans sometimes respond to guilt by feeling or acting out of despair. Well, God hears this response, and God feels love for the person who has spoken. And so God inspires the prophet Micah to respond. And so Micah turns to the people who have just heard God's case and speaks to them gently, saying, "You know what God asks of you. And what does God ask of you except to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God?" God has successfully put forth a legal case against God's people in this vast, mountainous courtroom, but instead of sentencing the people to sacrifice 1,000 rams, God gives them a freeing way of life centered around love, kindness, and humility. It's a simple, freeing commandment. And I think it reminds us that simplicity lies at the heart of God, that at a basic level, God just loves us unconditionally and invites us to love each other in the same way. Simple and life-giving. You know, I think when we're at our best, the church has a wonderful tension between complexity and simplicity. On the one hand, we want in our church to acknowledge that the world is complex and to be curious about it, to use our brains. I once saw a sign at an Episcopal church saying, "The Episcopal Church, where you don't have to check your mind at the door," right? We want to learn, to think, to be creative. We want to disagree with each other, sometimes to listen to each other, because God has given us different wisdom. But while we acknowledge the importance of complexity, we also want to acknowledge the simplicity at the heart of our tradition. Life-giving simplicity that God gives us that can free us when we feel overwhelmed or guilty or confused at the complexity of the world around us. Free to love and to love imperfectly. That's where the humility of walk humbly with our God comes in. It's okay that we don't do that perfectly. You know, I think some of the best art speaks to the wonderful tension between complexity and simplicity. The wonderful Beatles song, "All You Need Is Love," is quite complex musically. The time signature changes repeatedly. But also, it's such a simple song. The chorus of "All You Need Is Love" consists of 2 phrases. All you need is love, and love is all you need. That's it. A simple communication of something fundamental. And you know, the anthem our choir will sing in a short while from now lives into that too. The anthem y'all are singing, I believe, has some complicated chord progressions, according to Nick, our choir director, but also lyrics that are wonderfully simple. I think it's y'all are singing, "Sing my soul up to heaven," right? Speaking to the simple, wonderful, beautiful connection of God's love that exists on earth and in heaven. And so I think music like this can help us balance complexity and simplicity in our lives. A balance that I think many movements for social justice share. You know, the folks who have been protecting their neighbors from harm and or arrest by ICE in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, have, in some ways, used very complex systems of protection involving text chains, whistles, organizing protest marches. But on the other hand, it seems they're motivated by just a simple, basic desire to care for their neighbors. And so us too, in our walks with God, can take inspiration from this balance between complexity and simplicity, and be curious about the complexity of the world, listen to each other, to acknowledge that living out God's will in the world is complicated sometimes, while at the same time hearing God's invitation to be free of the ways that being overwhelmed or feeling guilty or confused can entrap us, and to see that God's basic invitation to us is to, and to not do this perfectly, is to do justice, love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. Amen.